I want to introduce our keynote speaker, who's going to speak for about 30 minutes, and we're going to have a number of other speakers who will speak for 10 minutes or so. And our first speaker is William Blum, who is one of the most eloquent and most unrestrained critics of U.S. empire that I know of. In the late 60s, he was one of the founders and editors of the Washington Free Press, the first alternative newspaper in Washington, D.C. Yes. In 1969, he wrote and published an expose of the CIA in which he revealed the names and addresses of more than 200 employees of the CIA. Remember, this was back when slowing down the CIA by outing its agents was considered a good thing, back before Bush and Cheney did it as retribution against a whistleblower. Blum has worked as a freelance, independent, and unembedded journalist in the United States, Europe, and South America, including reporting on the Allende government in Chile in the early 70s. His books, which are for sale at a table near the back, include The CIA: A Forgotten History, Rogue State, A Guide to the World's Only Superpower, West Bloc Dissident, A Cold War Memoir, Killing Hope, U.S. military and CIA interventions since World War II, and Freeing the World to Death, Essays on the American Empire. Blum also publishes a regular series of online columns called the Anti-Empire Report, which carries the subheadline, "Read this or George W. Bush will be president for the rest of your life." You can find Blum's writings at www.killinghope.org, and I recommend doing so. In September '06, a bunch of us organized an event on the National Mall in D.C. called Camp Democracy, and Blum was good enough to come and speak to us. And from what I could tell, he was not pulling any punches. He has compared President George W. Bush with Adolf Hitler, and the Iraq insurgency with the resistance against Nazi Germany. But he doesn't just criticize. He also suggests what we might do. I want to end this introduction by reading a wonderful quote from William Blum. Quote, "If I were the president, I could stop terrorist attacks against the United States in a few days, permanently. I would first apologize very publicly and very sincerely to all the widows and the orphans, the impoverished and the tortured, and all the many millions of other victims of American imperialism. I would then announce that America's global interventions, including the awful bombings, have come to an end. And I would inform Israel that it is no longer the 51st state of the Union, but oddly enough, a foreign country. I would then reduce the military budget by at least 90% and use the savings. I don't mean to steal all your applause introducing you. And use the savings to pay reparations to the victims and repair the damage from the many American bombings and invasions. There would be more than enough money. Do you know what 1 year of the U.S. military budget is equal to? 1 year. It's equal to more than $20,000 per hour for every hour since Jesus Christ was born. That's what I'd do on my first 3 days in the White House. On the fourth day, I'd be assassinated. Let's hope not. Please welcome William Blum.
Excuse me, I'm not used to having a fixed mic. I prefer a lapel mic because I move my head a lot. But tell me if my voice is moving out of its range because of this. My assignment here today, as I understand it, is to tell you how to quickly end the war in Iraq and how to prevent an invasion of Iran, as well as an invasion against Venezuela or Ecuador or Bolivia. In short, how to put an end to the American empire. Also, how to impeach Bush and Cheney. And while I'm at it, maybe how to end poverty forever and save the environment and legalize marijuana. Well, I would say good luck to all of us. Actually, as fanciful as that may sound, I think that if the radical left had access to the mass media for a year or so, not total access, but as much access as the neocons and the NPR-type centrists and liberals have, if we had similar access for a year, I think we would change the American mind in an amazing manner. As David mentioned, 2 years ago, an audio tape of bin Laden suggested to Americans that they should read my book, Rogue State. And as a result of that, I became an instant media star. I was on CNN with Wolf Blitzer, 45 minutes on C-SPAN, more than once on MSNBC, all that jazz. And the Washington Post, I live in Washington, D.C., the Post in the previous 10 years had not printed one of my many, many letters pointing out errors in their foreign policy coverage. Now, all of a sudden, my photo was on page 1 of the Post, and inside there was a long article about me. A few people called in to the TV, to C-SPAN when I was on, and some of the other radio programs, attacking me, asking me if I was not ashamed of being endorsed by bin Laden, implying that I was a friend of his or something. And I had to point out that he and I were not really friends. I had not even seen him in a few months, I said. Some of the hosts on radio and TV, including Wolf Blitzer, they wanted me to say clearly that I was repulsed by this endorsement. I refused to say that because I was not repulsed. As I explained to all my interviewers, there were two elements involved here. On the one hand, I am totally turned off by any form of religious fundamentalism, including the type practiced by the Taliban and the society created by the Taliban. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, I said to my audiences, I'm part of a movement which has the very ambitious goal of at least slowing down, if not stopping, the American empire. And for us to have any kind of chance at succeeding in this endeavor, we need access to the American mass movement, mass media. And I said, so what has happened has given me the chance to speak to many Americans I would not otherwise have a chance to speak to. And how can I not take advantage of that opportunity, I said. But many of those who called in were some of them were hostile, but most were supportive. They said they were thrilled to hear things said on their station which they had never heard before, or on any station. And I received more than 1,000 emails praising what I did, plus many which were very hostile, including some were threatening even. But I estimate I sold about 20,000 copies of my book, more than I would have otherwise. So in summary, I think there's a very large audience out there who are very anxious to learn about things that haven't been told about before, for their own education and to impress other people. There's an audience there which is very much waiting for us. But the problem is they're weighed down by the myths. They all hold a certain amount of basic beliefs about U.S. foreign policy, which I can call myths. And as long as they hold these basic beliefs, no matter what you say to them, it's like talking to a stone wall. I get emails all the time from people saying, my father or my brother or my mother, I've showed them what you've written, I've showed them. It doesn't have any effect upon them whatsoever. They say, oh, he must be quoting out of context. Or they just show no interest. But it's my theory that people like them, you have to get past this barrier of the myths that they carry around with them from a lifetime of being here. And so what are these myths? I've compiled a group of 8 such preconceptions which are held consciously or unconsciously. And here's what I think are those myths, which you must emphasize to all these poor benighted Americans. Number 1, U.S. foreign policy means well. American leaders may make mistakes, they may blunder, they may tell lies, they may on the very odd occasion do a bit more harm than good. But they do mean well. Their intentions are honorable. And this is very deeply ingrained in the American psyche. I'm sure many people in the anti-war movement carry a good portion of that kind of mentality. And you have to deal with that. And these people, they wonder why the rest of the world can't see how genuinely self-sacrificing we are in our foreign policy. They think of us as being a Salvation Army for the world. And the idea that the U.S. is prepared to do anything to dominate the world and exploit it economically is something that's very difficult for these Americans to swallow. They see our leaders on TV. They see them smiling and laughing. They see them with their families. They hear them speak about peace and love, about justice and human rights, about freedom and democracy. How can such people be immoral? How can they be called war criminals? They have names like George and Dick and Donald. There's not a single Abdullah or Muhammad in the bunch. And they all speak English. Well, George almost does. People named Muhammad or Abdullah cut off an arm or a leg for theft. And we know that that's horrible. We're too civilized for that. But people named George and Dick and Donald go around the world dropping millions of cluster bombs, and the huge number of them which fail to operate become landmines. And very soon, a child comes along and steps on one of them and loses an arm or a leg, or even worse. I like to ask the question, what does U.S. foreign policy have in common with Mae West? For those of you who are too young to know, she was a sex pot of the 1940s in Hollywood. And the story is told about a visitor to her mansion who looked around and said, "My goodness, what a beautiful home you have." And Mae West said, "Goodness had nothing to do with it." And that's one of the important points you have to make to the Americans whom you come in contact with. I'm speaking of them now as if they're a foreign people. By the way, how is this sound doing? If I were to write a book called The American Empire for Dummies, on page 1 I would say, don't look for any morality in U.S. foreign policy. There's no morality in the DNA of those policies. You have to forget about that. All the talk they feed us about the morality of our policies, they're just baggage they feed us all these cliches and platitudes, and you will never get beyond what they feed us as long as you maintain the idea that they mean well. You have to lose that idea. So when American officials state or imply benevolent motivations behind their actions, you should not let them get away with it. The officials and their supporters, because they're very accustomed to speaking of these high motivations, freedom and democracy, and they're very accustomed to the mass media not questioning that. And you should, if you have the chance, question those statements. That's at the basis of their policies. And the second myth I want to deal with is what I mentioned. The U.S. is really concerned with this thing called democracy. Even though in the past 60 years, the U.S. government has literally overthrown dozens of democratically elected governments. At the same time, they have interfered very seriously in dozens of democratic elections all over the world. They have succeeded in overthrowing more than 30 governments. They were attempted to overthrow 60 governments on my list. They've succeeded about half the time. It would be difficult to name a single government of the second half of the 20th century that was not supported by the U.S. government. Not just supported, but put into power and kept in power against the wishes of their own people. And if that means forcing a regime change, so be it. Now, the first thing the Bolsheviks have in mind when they speak of democracy is that the country in question is very receptive to corporate globalization, and at the same time very receptive to American military bases. Those are the first elements of being a democracy. The last thing they have in mind is closing the gap between the desperate poor and those for whom too much is not enough. So those are the beginning and the end points of U.S. concern with this thing called democracy. Myth number 3, anti-American sentiment in the Middle East is the result of them hating our alleged freedom and democracy, our wealth, our secular government, and our culture. This is what George Bush has been telling us for 6 years. That's why they hate us, because of these things. But polls taken in recent years in the Middle East show this to be a lie. Again and again, these polls show that the people in the Middle East really like America. What they hate is being bombed and invaded and overthrown and tortured. Yeah, that's not hard to understand, is it? They're not concerned about our miniskirts or our sexy films. They're concerned about the bombs falling on their schools and their churches. It's the same all over the world. In the period of the 1950s to the 1980s, in Latin America, the U.S. intervened in serious manner many, many times. And what happened? There was a rash of anti-American terrorism against the U.S., against our embassies, against our corporations, against our soldiers. This went on for 30 years in Latin America on a steady basis. And again, it wasn't because of anything in our culture. It was because of what we were doing there, overthrowing governments and supporting dictatorships. I don't think, by the way, that poverty plays much of a role in creating terrorists or anti-American or any kind. Keep in mind that the hijackers of 9/11, or the alleged hijackers, if you wish, they were not poor. They were not poor.
Stay away from the mic a little bit.
They were not poor.
Turn it down.
What?
You enunciate your P's very nicely.
they were these hijackers were the it's off now, I think. They were not poor peasants. They were educated. Bin Laden himself was a millionaire. He was at that time. So the moral is we should not confuse terrorism with revolution, as many people on the left do. Okay, basic belief or myth number 4. The U.S. has been pursuing a war on terror. But the fact is, the U.S. is not actually against terrorism per se. It's only terrorism which is carried out by people who are not allies of the empire. For example, there was a very lengthy and serious terrorist group in Florida for decades and decades, the anti-Castro terrorists. They have carried out hundreds and hundreds of terrorist acts all over the U.S. and in Europe and in Cuba. And yet they are given haven in Florida. You've heard of the most prominent one of them, Posada, Luis Posada Carillas. He was one of the masterminds, he and Orlando Bosch, the two masterminds behind the bombing of a Cuban airplane which killed 73 people. Both these two men, Posada and Bosch, lived in complete freedom and safety in Florida. How can we say we were against terrorism? That's just one example. Besides those two guys and many other Cubans, in Florida and elsewhere in the U.S., you have Chileans and Guatemalans and El Salvadorians, all of whom are guilty of the most horrible acts of terrorism and violence in their home countries, and they have lived here for years and years in peace and safety. The U.S. has also provided support for terrorists in Kosovo, Bosnia, Iran, Iraq, Chechnya, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and elsewhere, including cases where these people had close contact with Al-Qaeda, like in Bosnia and Kosovo. These are now our allies, and they're part of the free world. It's amazing that we can face the world and say we're against terrorism. We couldn't care less about terrorism. It's only those so-called terrorists who are not allies of us. Supporters of the war on terror tell us that it's been a success because there has not been any terrorist attack on U.S. soil in the 6+ years since 9/11. Well, there wasn't a terrorist attack on U.S. soil in the 6+ years before 9/11 either. So what does that prove? More importantly, since the first bombs fell on Afghanistan in 2001, there have been scores of terrorist attacks against American targets all over the world, in South Asia, in the Pacific, in the Middle East. Scores of attacks against U.S. targets. Military, civilian, churches, anything associated with the U.S. has been a target, including 2 major bombings in Indonesia, which killed large numbers of people. So how can, next time you hear one of these candidates speak of how the war on terror has been a success, if possible, mention a few of these points. But the worst feature of the war on terror is not simply its failure. It's the fact that what it's done in Afghanistan and Iraq are guaranteed to create thousands of new anti-American terrorists, and we'll be hearing from them in a terrible way in the future. Myth number 5. If Saddam Hussein had in fact possessed all those terrible weapons, then the U.S. would have been justified in invading and bombing Iraq. Of the numerous lies we've been told about the war in Iraq, that is the worst. That is the most insidious. It's the foundation upon which all the other lies are built. Because think about it. What possible reason would Saddam Hussein have had to attack the U.S. or Israel other than if he had an irresistible desire for mass national suicide? Because then, if he invaded Israel or the U.S., Iraq would have been totally devastated with nuclear weapons, if not conventional weapons. Why would he have done that? And the same question applies to Iran now. What possible reason would Iran have to invade the U.S. or Israel other than a great desire for mass national suicide? And if you keep this in mind, all the stuff we've been told about Iraq, all the intelligence failures, and all the accusations that the Democrats also fell for, all this stuff, it's all meaningless. If he wasn't going to invade, who cares? What is the difference? Whether he had those weapons or not, if he was no danger. But all these lies are based on that basic lie that he was a danger and an armed danger. Sometimes when I have a discussion with somebody about Iraq and they have no other argument left to defend the war, they say to me, well, tell me one thing. Aren't you glad that Saddam Hussein is out of power? And I say, no. And the person says, no? And I say, imagine that you had a knee problem and you went into surgery and by accident the surgeon amputated your entire leg. And I came to you and I say, well, aren't you glad you no longer have a knee problem? Well, the people of Iraq no longer have a Saddam Hussein problem. Besides which, many Iraqis supported Saddam Hussein, and it's been demonstrated very clearly that the great majority of people in Iraq had a much better quality of life under Saddam Hussein than they've had under the American occupation. That's been certified by a former prime minister of Iraq and other high officials. There's no question about that. In every category you can name, including torture perhaps. Okay, myth number 6, out of 8, I'll remind you. There are many who believe that invading and occupying Iraq was a mistake. But doing the same with Afghanistan, that was okay. Afghanistan has become like the Second World War. Because it was to revenge the murders of September 11th, wasn't it? What's wrong with that? But of the tens of thousands of people killed by the U.S. forces and their allies in Afghanistan, of those tens of thousands, how many can you name who had any involvement at all in the planning or the execution of the events of 9/11? I would say a rough estimate would be approximately none. So what kind of revenge is that? Bin Laden, of course, had been living for a while in Afghanistan, but he was invited there by one person, Muhammad Omar, the head of the Taliban. And why should the people of Iraq, of Afghanistan, have to pay the ultimate sacrifice because of the actions of one man? And the foreigners who came there, they came largely to take part in a civil war. There was a civil war going on between the Taliban and what used to be called the Northern Alliance. And these freedom fighters came to Afghanistan from all over to help the Taliban. For them, it was a religious mission, nothing to do with terrorism. It was not anti-American. It was they were fighting for Islam. And anyhow, I'm sorry. Okay, so we can't even accuse Afghanistan of being a haven for these terrorists. The great majority of them came there for other reasons. The seventh myth on my list has to do with the Cold War. In the Cold War, the U.S., we were told, defeated this thing called the International Communist Conspiracy. But if you think what you have now are lies and deceit, let me take you back. In the Cold War, the big, huge lie we were told was that there was something out there called the International Communist Conspiracy, the Red Menace, whose purpose was to take over and enslave the world. And we were all told that it was international. There was no escaping it. We had no choice. And almost all Americans accepted this without question. I myself was a good, loyal anti-communist until past the age of 30. In fact, I was working at the State Department in Washington, planning on becoming a Foreign Service officer, so I could join the Foreign Service and do my part to fight the communist menace. But it was all a con game. There was never any such animal as the International Communist Conspiracy. What there was people all over the Third World fighting for a better life, improvements in their political, economic, and social conditions. And this attitude was in conflict with the desires of the American political elite. And so the U.S. government sent in force and the CIA to overthrow these governments and these movements. And in almost every case, there was hardly any Soviet involvement whatsoever. So we were not fighting the Soviet Union. We were not fighting communism, even though some of the people that we killed and overthrew in these third world countries belonged to communist parties. It was not any kind of international movement. If you want to see what a con game this was, remember the Cold War ended in 1991. That was the end, supposedly, of the international communist menace. And what happened? Nothing changed in American foreign policy. Since then, we have intervened and bombed and overthrown as much as before the Cold War ended. What does that tell you? It tells me that the whole thing of the Cold War was a con game, a ploy. It had nothing to do with fighting for freedom or democracy. It was to expand the empire. Now, our leaders could not say back then that they were intervening to fight social change. So they said they were intervening to fight communism or fighting for democracy and freedom. Just like now they can't say they're intervening to I've lost my train of thought. They can't say now they're intervening to help the corporations or to help Israel or to expand the empire. They say they're intervening to fight for democracy and freedom. Keep this in mind. Following the bombing of Iraq in 1991, after the Cold War was over, the U.S. wound up with military bases in Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, Oman, and the United Arab Emirates. Following its bombing of Yugoslavia in 1999, the U.S. wound up with military bases in Kosovo, Albania, Bulgaria, Macedonia, Hungary, Bosnia, and Croatia. Following its bombing of Afghanistan in 2001 and 2002, the U.S. wound up with military bases in Afghanistan, Pakistan, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, Georgia, Yemen, and Djibouti. Following its bombing of Iraq in 2003, the U.S. wound up with Iraq. This is not very subtle foreign policy. It certainly is not covert. The men who run the American empire are not easily embarrassed. And that's the way the empire grows. A base in every region ready to put down any threat to the empire, whether real or imagined. Keep in mind that 63 years after the end of the Second World War, The U.S. still maintains large military bases in Japan and Germany. 55 years after the end of the war in Korea, we still have tens of thousands of soldiers in South Korea. Well, I have a bit more, but my time is running out, I've been told. Maybe I'll save this if someone asks. My last myth has to do with the media and how it adds to all these other myths, the American media. If someone wants to hear that, you can ask me a question. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And we are going to have discussion and questions and answers for all of our panelists after a number of additional panelists who will be speaking for 10 minutes or less each. And we are very privileged to have with us first Dr. Dalia Waspy, who has given some of the most powerful presentations that I have seen on what life is like now in Iraq for, yes, believe it or not, the Iraqis. Waspy is an American born to a Jewish mother and an Iraqi father. She spent her early childhood in Iraq. She has been back to visit Iraq during the current occupation. In 2006, she spoke at a congressional forum, and her remarks followed those of veteran U.S. spy and Middle East policy expert Paul Pillar, who had said that the Shia in Iraq owed the United States thanks for overthrowing Saddam Hussein. Waspy began her remarks by noting that in 1991, the United States encouraged the Shia to rise up against Hussein and then stood back while 10,000 were massacred, that Hussein had been a CIA agent and had begun his killing spree when the CIA fed him the names of leftists to murder, and that sanctions imposed primarily by the U.S. and Britain had strengthened his rule. Iraqis, Waspy said in her congressional testimony, have had just about all the help they can take from America. Dalia's website is liberatethis.com. Please ask her to tell you about her plan to have Bush, Cheney, Rumsfeld, and several others form a naked pyramid. Dalia Waspy.
I got to be careful what I say to certain people when they'll be introducing me. But, you know, my dad's from Iraq, eye for an eye. So one day after The Hague, they will serve their terms at Abu Ghraib in my A Girl Can Dream. So as you heard, I have kind of a diverse background, and I usually open my talks to give that background because I believe it gives me license to say whatever I want. But I speak to you today on behalf of relatives on my mother's side, Ashkenazi Jews who fled their homeland of Austria during Hitler's Anschluss. It is for them that we say never again. I speak to you today on behalf of relatives on my father's side who are not living but dying under the occupation of this administration's deadly foray in Iraq. From the lack of security to the lack of basic supplies, to the lack of electricity, to the lack of potable water, to the lack of reconstruction, to the lack of education, to the lack of health care, to the lack of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, they are much worse off now than before we invaded. Never again should apply to them too. Now, about 60 years ago, the citizens of the world looked at the German people and said, how could you let this happen? Now, if you have the chance to travel abroad, or if you're from abroad, ask people what they think of Americans today. They are asking the same thing. And so, unfortunately, that's how we're going down in history. Now, I have to assume my role in it. I have to take responsibility for my contribution. I have paid taxes, and simply by living here, in the country that profits from what my government does, I am benefiting from it. And sometimes people resist saying, you know, it's not me, it's those people in that government. Well, they're doing it in our name. And that's why we're all here today, to continue to push this country in the right direction. I've been torturing the friends who've been with me in the last couple of days, especially in the drive up, because a couple days ago we watched the movie Braveheart. And I'm really not that good at accents, but I haven't stopped trying to speak in a Scottish brogue ever since then. But you know, in that movie, you see what resistance is, and you see what they're fighting for and how they're fighting. And at the end of the film, you hear William Wallace's voice say, "Starving and outnumbered, they fought like warrior poets. They fought like Scotsmen and won their freedom." And we see that today in Iraq, that they are fighting, they are starving and outpowered. And these people are fighting for their dignity, for their nation, for their families, for their identity. And they have something that we don't really have a clue about. And that is a history of 10,000 years. We are not the first to covet and invade for the resources of Mesopotamia. We probably won't be the last, but we're not going to be allowed to stay any more than anybody else has. And that's really why I hope that one of the outcomes of this weekend, despite that some leaders of the peace movement, I don't consider myself to be part of the peace movement because, and I'm not sure who I'm quoting, but peace does not mean the silence of the cemeteries. I'm with the justice movement, so because no justice, no peace. But some leaders in the peace movement have failed to acknowledge the legitimacy of the Iraqi resistance. But really all we have to do is recognize that they are the Iraqi people. Now, if you do the math with me, pick any country on the face of this earth, about half male, half female. That's how you divide up the population, give or take 1 or 2%. But you add up the women, the girls, and the boys. The majority of any population are women and children. So if we cannot endorse the struggle of Iraqi women and children to survive in a country where now there are over 1 million widowed and orphaned, then we really do need to assume responsibility as playing a hand with our government. The Iraqi resistance, which probably, while there are many, many factions, a significant faction is the old army. Now I know if space aliens came to our shores to try to take over, and I say space aliens because that's really the most likely invading force that will come, if they came, I know who would be on the front lines defending their homes, their country, their nation, their way of life. And that would be the U.S. military. They would do what they were trained to do. It's the same thing in Iraq. They have been invaded. Their focus is kicking out the occupier. And it's quite reasonable to assume that when that job is complete, that the old army will work to reestablish law and order. I was it was an honor to hear Lynn Stewart speak yesterday, but I was also relieved to hear the mention of the potential of using the right to self-defense. Because while no one wants to be identified as violent, and I think we've been very well trained to say, no, we're not going to do anything violent, we're going to stay nonviolent. But think about it now. How dare any American or British criticize the actions of legitimate resistance to illegal occupation? With the violence that we have unleashed on the rest of the world, that we cannot stand here and say, they really should use nonviolent means. They are the reason that I believe, and it's certainly up for debate, but today, and including the 60 years before of Palestinians fighting for justice, and today the Iraqis which the occupation of Palestine has now been extended to include Iraq, that they are fighting to bring this empire to a screeching halt. We have to be careful and not feel limited to support the Iraqi people and support their right to resist our illegal occupation. The other aspect, another aspect that I usually hear from the left is that, well, you know, I do think we should bring the troops home, but it's just going to be a mess when we leave. Like, we got such a good thing going now, we don't want to mess it up. I want to point out that the reality on the ground is that Iraqi society today looks much like Latin American society in the 1980s when the CIA was involved. And if you look at the roster of names, it's pretty much the same people. Donald Rumsfeld, Dick Cheney, John Negroponte. When Negroponte's name comes up, just run for the hills because death squads are coming. But in the same way that the CIA trained death squads in Latin America that then ushered in torture, disappearances, bodies in the streets, and total chaos, that's what's happening today in Iraq. So understand that when we leave, the financing of death squads ends. Those people are going to be out of jobs, and it's also reasonable to expect that Iraq will be better off. Also, that since Iraq was better off before we invaded, it's illogical to perceive that they will be worse off once we leave. After 10,000 years of history, I feel pretty confident in saying that they'll be able to throw something together in the cradle of civilization. The last point I want to make, thank you. The last point I want to make is that there are now around 20,000 soldiers who've gone AWOL, absent without leave. While there are just a handful who have taken a public stand, you basically have, I don't know my military terms, I don't know if that's a unit or a platoon or a battalion, but that's a lot of people. It is an extraordinary thing after the brainwashing that takes place in basic training and with your unit to buck the system. But these are extraordinary times. So we all got to take it up a notch a little bit. So perhaps, and I know that many of you are doing this already, but we need to make the effort to seek out those 20,000 and make sure they have our support. These are the troops that I support. These are the troops who are resisting, because as we established 60 years ago in the Nuremberg trials, it's not okay to say I was just following orders. And now 5 years into occupation, it's as if like I had a timetable in my head that was kind of a grace period. And now we all got to kick it up a notch because it's about 10 years too long. I'm moving into the next phase to go into overdrive. I told my dad, troops home by the end of 2008 at latest. So I'm with you in the struggle. It's an honor to share the podium with these very impressive and wonderful speakers. Thank you so much for having me here.